A cop orders a homeless veteran to leave the park. Seconds later, 6 SEALs silence the entire block. In the quiet heart of a city, a homeless veteran sits alone on a park bench, unseen, overlooked, dismissed. But when a police officer orders him to leave, everything changes in an instant. Seconds later, 6 Navy SEALs arrive to silence the entire block, not with violence, but with a presence that demands respect. This is the story of Frank Harlan, a man whose sacrifices were forgotten by the world, but never by those who truly mattered. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now let's jump in. The early morning haze settled over Ashwood Park, the kind of park where no one lingered too long. It wasn't the cleanest part of town, but it offered a handful of wooden benches under the cover of tired oak trees. The city moved past it, never through it. Joggers chose longer routes. Mothers crossed the street to other playgrounds. But for one man, this bench had become home. Frank Harlan sat there most mornings, a battered olive jacket draped over his shoulders, frayed cuffs hugging calloused hands. His beard, thick and silver, veiled most of his face, but his eyes, sharp, steady, distant, told stories no one dared ask about. He spent his mornings feeding birds with broken pieces of day-old bread and watching the world pass by like a distant parade. Few knew his name. Fewer still cared. To most, Frank was just another homeless man. To the children, he was the quiet figure who sometimes left paper boats floating in the puddles after the rain. To the store owners nearby, he was harmless but invisible. He asked for nothing. He wanted nothing. He just existed. But something about him unsettled Officer Daniels. Daniels wasn't a bad man, just young, impatient, and desperate to prove himself. The city had been cracking down on vagrancy, and Daniels wanted to make a show of cleaning up the park. It was a Tuesday when he approached Frank. The sky was pale, the kind that promised rain but never delivered. "You can't sleep here anymore," Daniels barked, his hand resting a little too eagerly on his belt. "City ordinance. Move along." Frank didn't answer. He simply dropped another crumb, watching the pigeons fight over it. "I said move along." A pause. Frank's gaze slowly lifted, locking onto the officer with a depth that made Daniels shift his stance. Not defiant, not pleading, just steady. "I'll leave," Frank said, his voice a low rasp, the kind that had weathered decades of storms. "Just feeding the birds." Daniels scoffed, puffing his chest. "Feed him somewhere else. Not my problem where you go, but you can't stay here." There was no crowd, no audience, just the quiet rustle of trees and the shuffle of pigeons. Frank gathered his few belongings, a small pack, a folded blanket, and an old, weathered photograph he tucked carefully into his jacket pocket. He stood, slow but deliberate, and began walking away. Daniels called after him. "You people think you can take up space like this? There are rules." Frank didn't turn back. He just kept walking, his boots worn thin, his steps unhurried. But someone had been watching from across the street. A man in civilian clothes, with a quiet earpiece tucked behind his hair. He tapped something into his phone, his expression unreadable. Within minutes, the block would fall silent. Not by force, not by sirens, but by something far more deliberate. And Frank Harlan was not who they thought he was. Frank's boots scraped the uneven sidewalk as he left the park, each step pulling him further from the scene, but not from the weight of it. He didn't walk with urgency. He never did. Life had taught him that rushing only made you visible, and Frank had long since learned to move like the wind, present, but untouchable. He found another bench a few streets down, this one chipped and lonely near a boarded-up bookstore. He sat with the same slow care, unfolded the photograph from his jacket, and rested it gently in his lap. The edges were soft from years of handling. The image, 6 men in worn combat gear, smiling in that familiar, exhausted way soldiers do when they know the moment might be their last. Frank was in the center, though it would have taken a keen eye to notice. His beard had been dark then, his shoulders broader, his eyes just as steady. On the back, a faint inscription. "Echo Team, until the last." Frank rubbed his thumb over the words, the memories pressing against his ribs like ghosts waiting to be remembered. Across the street, the man with the earpiece finished his quiet message. His name was Connor Bishop. He'd been watching Frank for months, tracking his routines, his silences, his exile. He hadn't made contact yet. Orders were orders. But today, something had changed. Connor spoke softly into his comms. Target confirmed. We're moving. The reply came with surgical precision. Echo 6 en route. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels radioed in his update like he'd just cleaned the city's streets single-handedly. His partner, Officer Ruiz, offered a half-hearted nod as he sipped his coffee from the patrol car. You didn't need to be that hard on him, Ruiz said, glancing in the mirror. Guy wasn't bothering anyone. Daniels shrugged. Vagrants attract more vagrants. Just following protocol. Ruiz stared at him for a moment, his brow pinching. Yeah, well, sometimes you don't know who you're pushing. The weight of those words didn't land. Daniels was already scrolling through his phone, satisfied with his morning's work. Back on the corner of 5th and Elm, a quiet convoy had begun to converge. Nondescript vehicles. Men in plain clothes. No sirens. No uniforms. But their movements were crisp. Controlled. Surgical. Connor crossed the street, his boots pacing softly against the cracked pavement. He stopped a few feet from Frank's bench. It's been a while, Commander, he said, his voice steady but carrying something deeply respectful. Frank folded the photo and tucked it back inside his jacket. Don't call me that, Frank muttered, his eyes still on the pigeons gathering near his boots. Connor offered a small smile, the kind that knew better than to press. They disrespected you, Connor said quietly. That doesn't sit well with the boys. Frank shook his head, his gaze distant. Let it go. I'm nobody now. Not to them, you're not. Across the block, 4 more men appeared, each one moving with the unmistakable calm of someone trained to end problems before they start. Frank's fingers traced the edge of the photo in his pocket. You shouldn't have come, he said softly. We never really left, Connor answered. The street seemed to hold its breath. And just like that, the block would soon remember who Frank Harlan really was. Frank sat quietly, his shoulders heavy, his breath measured. The pigeons fluttered away as the other men approached, each one older now, but still cut from the same cloth. Their steps were soft, their presence sharp. They weren't here to cause a scene. They were here because the weight of disrespect did not sit lightly with Echo Team. Hey, Commander, another voice joined, gravelly warm. A man with salt and pepper hair and the unmistakable limp of old injuries. His name was Mason, Echo 4. You always did pick the worst neighborhoods. Frank shook his head with a tired half-smile. Didn't expect you to come. We heard, Mason said, taking a seat beside him like they had done 1,000 times before. Didn't take kindly to it. One by one, the others circled the bench. No weapons in sight, no aggression, just presence, steady, undeniable. Connor remained standing, scanning the block like muscle memory still guided his every breath. You trained us to answer calls that never came over the radio. This was one of them. Frank's jaw tensed, a flicker of something he wasn't ready to feel. I walked away from that life, Frank said quietly, his eyes still focused somewhere far beyond the street in front of him. I'm just an old man now. You're our old man, Mason said with a shrug. And someone forgot what that means. Their words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Their calm was louder than any siren. From across the intersection, Officer Daniels was oblivious to the quiet storm brewing. But Officer Ruiz, sitting in the patrol car, was starting to notice. He watched the men, how they stood, how they moved, how their heads tilted as they scanned the environment. This wasn't some random gathering. Ruiz keyed his radio. Daniels, you might want to come take a look at this. Daniels sighed, annoyed. What now? Just come look. Daniels crossed the street, his boots striking the pavement with impatience. He didn't see danger. He saw 5 middle-aged men and 1 homeless guy on a bench. To him, still nothing more than a nuisance. You again? Daniels called out to Frank. Thought I told you to move along. Connor turned slowly, his stance relaxed but impossibly deliberate. Is there a problem, officer? Daniels' hand rested on his belt again. Yeah, there is. He's loitering. Against city ordinance. Mason exhaled a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Funny thing about ordinances, they don't outrank loyalty. Daniel scowled. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but... Ruiz approached, his face pale now, his eyes locked on Connor's posture. Daniels. Stop. Now. What? Ruiz's voice dropped an octave. That's Echo Team. Daniels blinked. Who? Ruiz's throat tightened. SEALs. Special Operations. Ghosts. Daniels scoffed. Come on, that's not. Check your radio. Ruiz interrupted, his voice sharp now. I just called it in. These men, they don't just show up. They don't exist on paper. And they don't forget. Daniels looked back at the group, his false confidence draining with every heartbeat. Frank finally met his gaze, calm, ancient, immovable. We're leaving, Frank said, standing. You don't need to see the rest. But the block would remember. And the silence that followed would speak louder than anything Officer Daniels had ever shouted. Daniels stepped back, the weight of Ruiz's words sinking into his skin like cold rain. His hand drifted away from his belt as his breath faltered. The park, the sidewalk, even the pigeons seemed to fall under an invisible hush, as if the street itself recognized something sacred had walked through. Echo Team. Daniels mumbled under his breath, still processing. The name didn't just carry weight. It was etched into the kind of files with entire pages blacked out, files he wasn't authorized to read. Frank gave him one last, steady look. Not angry, not superior, just profoundly disappointed. You did your job, Frank said quietly, his voice like gravel worn smooth over years. Now I'll do mine. I'll leave. Daniels wanted to speak, to regain control of the situation, but words felt impossibly small now. His throat tightened as the gravity of his mistake settled around him like a vice. Ruiz lowered his radio. His voice, once casual, now carried a respectful edge. Let him go. Daniels swallowed hard, nodding without realizing it. His pulse pounded in his ears. Frank turned his back on them, walking with the same steady pace, the other men falling in behind him, not as a threat, but as a wall, a silent reminder that some men never truly walk alone. As they disappeared down the street, the silence left behind was heavier than the noise that usually filled the block. The traffic seemed to slow. Conversations hushed. Even the wind seemed to pause. Frank didn't say much as they walked. He never did. But the men around him filled the space the way family does, with quiet presence. You could have called us sooner, Mason said, slipping a hand into his jacket pocket. You think we wouldn't have shown up? I didn't want this, Frank muttered. I didn't want to pull anyone back into old battles. Connor offered a faint smile. We're not here to fight, Frank. We're here to remember. Frank's shoulders sagged under the weight of something invisible. It's not about the cop. It's about being forgotten. About waking up one day and realizing you vanished while the world kept spinning. Mason's voice softened. You didn't vanish, brother. You just stopped asking to be seen. They paused at a corner store where the owner, a wiry old man named Leon, nodded at Frank with a quiet familiarity. Leon had been slipping him sandwiches and coffee for months without asking questions. Today, Leon stepped outside with a fresh cup in hand and a plastic bag filled with warm bread. No charge, Leon said, placing the bag in Frank's hand. Not today. Frank hesitated, but the look in Leon's eyes left no room for pride. Thank you, Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. Leon glanced at the men flanking Frank, reading the scene for what it was without needing the details. Didn't know you had friends like these. Neither did I, Frank said, offering the smallest of smiles. As they continued walking, the city began to take notice. People who had passed Frank 100 times without a second glance now stared, sensing, perhaps for the first time, that they had misjudged the man on the bench. Frank didn't need the attention. He didn't want it. But sometimes, respect finds its way back, not through noise, but through undeniable presence. And today, the streets of Ashwood were learning that silence can echo forever. The group stopped at a quiet courtyard just outside an abandoned train station, one of the few places in the city where the concrete had surrendered to weeds and silence. It wasn't far from where Frank spent most of his nights. He liked it there. It reminded him of places he'd camped overseas, forgotten edges of the map where no one came looking. The men formed a loose circle, settling onto crates, leaning against rusted railings. They didn't press him with questions. They didn't need to. Their presence alone told him they'd come for more than just the insult at the park. Connor finally broke the quiet. You've been off the grid for almost a decade. We've been trying to track you for 2. Frank shrugged slightly. Didn't want to be found. Mason let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. Yeah, well, you trained us better than that. Frank looked away, his hand absently brushing the edge of the photo in his pocket. His fingers trembled, just for a moment. Connor noticed. You're still carrying it. Frank's jaw set. Some things you don't put down. The weight in the air thickened. The others said nothing, but their eyes softened. We buried Daniel 2 years ago, Connor said carefully. Frank closed his eyes. The name hit him like a silent blow to the chest. No one could find you, Mason added. We waited for you at the service. Frank's voice, low and rough, barely carried. I wasn't ready to face that. Connor's voice remained steady, though his throat tightened. He asked for you. The words hung there, sharp, unforgiving. Frank's silence was not avoidance. It was punishment. He had exiled himself long before the city turned its back on him. Why'd you vanish, Frank? Mason asked, his tone free of judgment, but full of a brother's ache. After the last op, you just disappeared. Frank rubbed his temple, the weight of memories pressing in. Because I didn't know how to come home without them. Without all of us. Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know Daniel's daughter? She was there at the funeral. She said her dad used to tell her stories about the man on the bench who always watched over them. Frank's brow furrowed. She meant you, Connor added. He kept track of you, even when you disappeared. None of us forgot you, Frank. You forgot yourself. The silence tightened like a wire. Frank reached into his pocket and finally unfolded the photograph again. 6 men, younger, alive, whole. The inscription on the back had always been a promise, but Frank had convinced himself it was just a memory. Until the last. Frank's voice cracked for the first time. I didn't know how to be the last. Mason's hand landed on his shoulder. Firm. Unshaken. You're not. We're still here. Frank blinked hard, the sharp burn behind his eyes unfamiliar after years of numbness. Connor sat back, his voice soft but resolute. There's still a place for you, Frank. Not because you're Echo Team. Not because of what you did. But because of who you are. For the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to believe that maybe he hadn't vanished. Maybe he had simply been waiting to be found. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked courtyard. Frank sat quietly, his fingers still resting on the worn photograph. The men around him allowed the silence to linger, each of them feeling the weight of what had just been said. Connor eventually spoke, his voice measured. You know, the city's not what it used to be. Things changed while you were gone. A lot of people think they can walk over the quiet ones now. Frank's gaze drifted across the street where kids played with a deflated soccer ball, their laughter echoing off empty walls. Maybe they can, he said softly. Maybe they should. I'm not here to fight anymore. That's not why we came, Mason said, his tone patient. We didn't show up to drag you into some fight. We came because you're ours. Frank raised an eyebrow, a faint trace of humor in his voice. I thought you came because of that kid cop. Connor smirked. That was just the excuse. Mason leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But since we're here, we figured we'd clear up his misunderstanding. There's a difference between enforcing rules and forgetting respect. Frank gave a soft grunt. And what? You want to teach him that? Connor's eyes sharpened. We already have. Back near the patrol car, Daniels paced restlessly, chewing on the inside of his cheek. Ruiz watched him, his expression unreadable. You really didn't know? Ruiz finally asked. Daniels shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. Nobody tells us who these people are. We're just supposed to clean the streets. Keep the parks clear. Ruiz's gaze darkened. There's cleaning the streets, and there's stepping on graves you don't see. Daniels scowled. So what, they're ghosts? Untouchable. Ruiz glanced at the empty park bench across the street, remembering how quickly those men had appeared, how quietly they had shut down the entire block without a word. "They're not ghosts," Ruiz said quietly. "They're the kind of men who carry wars in their silence. And you just told one of them to move along like he was nothing." Daniels looked down, shame tightening his chest. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Ruiz said, his voice cold now. "You didn't care to know." Daniels sank into the patrol car, the weight of his mistake finally crashing down. Elsewhere, word was starting to spread, quietly, like embers catching in dry grass. Shopkeepers whispered. Bystanders speculated. Some thought they had seen something tactical, others believed it was just a group of old friends. But a few, those with military ties, recognized the movements, the discipline, the unmistakable calm of men who didn't need to raise their voices to be heard. Within hours, a quiet ripple moved through the veteran community. The man on the bench. Frank Harlan. Echo 1. Still walking. Still watching. And by the time the sun dipped behind the buildings, Frank's story was no longer one of neglect. It was a story rediscovered. Frank didn't know it yet, but the next few days would pull him into a current he couldn't step away from. Some debts were about to be repaid. Some honors quietly restored. The following morning, Frank returned to Ashwood Park. Same bench, same pigeons, same worn boots. But something in the air had shifted. People who had ignored him yesterday now passed with cautious glances, some nodding with quiet recognition, others simply choosing to walk a little further away, not out of fear, but out of respect they didn't fully understand. Frank noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't react. He tossed breadcrumbs to the pigeons, his motions slow, deliberate. The photograph remained in his jacket, resting against his chest like it always had. From across the park, a teenager hesitated, gripping the strap of his worn backpack. He looked like he'd been circling for a while, unsure whether to approach. Eventually, he crossed the grass, his steps nervous. "Excuse me, sir," the boy began, his voice thin, but polite. You were an Echo team, right?" Frank's hand paused midair, a crumb balanced between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't answer immediately. He studied the kid, skinny, maybe 16, wearing sneakers that had seen too many winters. "What do you know about Echo Team?" Frank asked, his voice calm, but weighted. The boy shifted his backpack. "My brother, he served Afghanistan. He used to tell me stories about Echo Team. He said they were the ones who showed up when no one else would. The ones who didn't leave anyone behind." Frank's throat tightened. "What's your brother's name?" The boy looked down. His name was Matthew. Matthew Torres. He didn't make it back. Frank's gaze lowered to the pigeons. The name wasn't familiar, but the loss was. "Why are you here?" Frank asked softly. The boy shrugged, but his voice trembled. "I don't know. I guess. I just wanted to meet someone who made it back. Someone who knew what it was like." Frank considered that, the silence stretching comfortably between them. "You never really make it back," Frank said finally. "You just learn to keep walking." The boy nodded slowly, as if those words filled a gap he didn't know he had. Frank reached into his pack, pulling out a small, folded cloth. He unraveled it carefully, revealing a simple military patch, faded but intact. The old Echo Team insignia. "This isn't worth much," Frank said, his thumb brushing over the stitched edges. "But it's real." He extended it toward the boy. The kid's eyes widened. I can't take that." "You can," Frank said firmly. "And you will. Carry it. Remember it. Not because of who we were, but because of who your brother was." The boy took the patch, his hands trembling, his throat thick with words he couldn't form. "Thank you," he whispered. Frank offered a small nod. "What's your name?" "Leo." "Well, Leo, you make your brother proud. You keep walking." The boy stepped back, clutching the patch as if it were made of gold, and left the park with his head held higher than when he'd arrived. Frank turned back to the pigeons, the quiet settling around him once more. But the ripple had already traveled further than he realized. By sunset, Leo's story would spread, first to his family, then to his school, then to the local veteran groups. And the story would keep growing, painting a portrait of the quiet man on the bench who still carried the weight of Echo Team. And somewhere beyond the city, men who had once served with Frank would start making calls. Because some stories were never meant to be forgotten. That evening, as the city's lights flickered on one by one, a subtle but profound shift was underway in Ashwood and far beyond. What began as a quiet ripple in a worn-down park was stirring deeper, unseen currents across the nation. Connor Bishop sat alone in a modest apartment overlooking the harbor. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across old mission photos pinned to the wall, dog tags resting on the table, and a folded American flag, carefully preserved, sitting in a wooden case like a silent monument. Years of memory and sacrifice weighed on the space, a reminder of battles fought in distant lands and wars that lingered in quiet hearts. His phone buzzed softly on the table. The screen lit up with a brief message from Mason, another member of Echo Team. "It's time." Connor's fingers hovered above the screen before replying. Echo Team is gathering. Across the country, those words stirred a network of silent veterans. Men who had long since stepped away from the front lines, living quiet, unseen lives. Some were retired. Others had vanished into obscurity. Many bore scars, some visible, others etched deep in memory. But none could ignore the call. For them, it wasn't just a message. It was a summons to reclaim what had been lost, to stand once more in the name of brotherhood, honor, and respect. Marcus Shade Turner, renowned for his near-mythical stealth missions, carefully packed his gear in a worn duffel bag. Elias Doc Ramirez, whose steady hands had saved countless lives amid chaos, sat quietly reflecting on years past before quietly setting down a faded photograph of his team. Each man carried Frank's story in their hearts, either through personal memories or whispered legends shared in the dark corners of veteran gatherings. One by one, they prepared, not for battle, but for a reunion long overdue. Back in Ashwood, Frank sat outside a small diner, clutching a hot cup of black coffee as the cool night settled around him. The worn flip phone in his pocket vibrated softly, the screen illuminating a single name, Connor. His fingers hesitated, memories flooding back, faces of friends lost, silent promises, and years of absence. Finally, he answered. "Frank." Connor's voice was steady, calm, but beneath it lay a current of urgency and something deeply familiar. "We're coming home. It's time. The team is ready." Frank closed his eyes briefly. The weight of decades pressed against his chest, but beneath the heaviness stirred a flicker of resolve. "All right," Frank said at last, his voice low but resolute. "Let's bring the team back." As the call echoed through the night, Ashwood's streets began to hum with anticipation. Quiet neighborhoods where veterans had faded into the background now found themselves stirred. Local veterans groups began mobilizing quietly. Volunteers reached out offering help and support. Neighbors who had passed by Frank without a second glance began to ask questions, to listen. The story of the man on the bench, the forgotten warrior, was spreading. Tonight, this was no longer just Frank's story. It had become a story of a community remembering itself, of debts owed and honor restored. The stage was set. Echo Team was coming home, not with the thunder of war, but with the quiet strength of those who never truly left. The dawn broke over Ashwood with a quiet chill in the air. The sky was a blanket of gray, heavy with the promise of rain, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a slow, steady pulse that had been dormant for too long. Across the city, men who had long ago stepped away from the noise of the world were waking to a call they could no longer ignore. Marcus Shade Turner was the first to arrive at the old warehouse on the city's industrial edge. From the outside, the building looked abandoned, its brickwork cracked, windows clouded with grime. But inside, it was becoming something else, a refuge, a meeting place, a place to remember. Shade moved silently through the dusty room, dust motes swirling in the shafts of morning light. Tables were laid out with care, weapons cases locked and stacked, boots polished to a dull shine, maps carefully unfolded and marked. This wasn't a call to arms, it was a call to brotherhood. One by one, the others arrived. Elias Doc Ramirez stepped through the door with his usual calm demeanor, the lines on his face telling stories of lives saved and losses mourned. Mason entered next, walking with a careful gait, old wounds still aching but spirit unbroken. Connor Bishop followed last, greeting each man with a nod weighted with decades of shared experience, silence, and sacrifice. Though Frank had yet to arrive, the room felt complete, each man carrying his story in their eyes, in the tightness of their shoulders, in the steady grip of their hands. Connor finally broke the silence. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of unspoken history. We're here because Frank asked us to be, because respect was taken from him, from all of us, and it's time to bring it back. Shade cracked a tired smile. You mean that cop who told the old man to move along? What did he think he was doing? Mason shook his head slowly. It's not just about that cop. It's about every veteran pushed aside, ignored, forgotten. Frank isn't just one man. He represents all of us who've been left behind. Doc nodded. We don't need to fight anyone. We don't need violence. We just need to remind this city who we are, what we stood for, and what we still stand for. Outside, the city was beginning to hum with a different kind of energy. Word had spread quietly but firmly through veteran groups, neighborhood watch circles, and local organizations. Support was growing, meals being prepared by volunteers, messages of encouragement shared across social media, neighbors talking in hushed, respectful tones. This wasn't a gathering of ghosts. This was a movement, a quiet, powerful movement toward recognition, toward justice, toward healing. Minutes later, the doors creaked open, and Frank stepped inside. His pace was slow, measured. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of men he hadn't seen in years, brothers in arms who had waited as long as he had to be found again. He nodded at Connor, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. Let's finish what we started. Without hesitation, the men fell into formation, not a battle line, but a circle of unwavering solidarity, of respect and brotherhood. Outside the warehouse, Ashwood waited. The streets were quiet but charged, ready to witness something more than just a reunion. For the first time in a long while, the city's forgotten warriors had come home. The news didn't arrive with flashing lights or blaring sirens. It came slowly, quietly, like a soft wind shifting the dust in forgotten corners. In Ashwood, stories usually got lost in the noise of daily life. But this one was different. It started with whispers between neighbors, a nod shared in the corner store, a carefully worded post on social media groups for veterans. The story of Frank Harlan, the homeless man on the park bench, and the sudden gathering of Echo Team rippled through the city's veins. Inside the old warehouse on the industrial edge, the men prepared with an unhurried precision born of years under fire. There were no grand speeches, no shouting orders. Instead, steady hands unpacked well-worn gear, folded maps were spread out and studied, and old faces exchanged quiet looks heavy with memory and respect. Frank moved among them with the humility of a man who had carried too much for too long. His eyes, sharp yet soft, scanned the room, occasionally catching the faces of younger veterans, those new to the shadows they had long inhabited. He said little, but his presence was a steady anchor, a reminder of all they had endured. Outside, word reached the local police precinct. Officer Ruiz, who had long seen beyond the badge, worked to prepare his colleagues for what was coming. Not as an act of defiance, but as a quiet warning. Respect is earned, yes, but it is also demanded. Daniels remained silent. The earlier arrogance that had marked his approach was gone, replaced by cautious uncertainty and a dawning realization that some things were bigger than a city ordinance. At Ashwood Park, the community began to stir. People came not out of spectacle or gossip, but out of a growing sense of shared history and empathy. Children played nearby, their laughter a fragile soundtrack over the shifting tension. Elders exchanged hushed stories of wars fought, sacrifices made, and lives forever changed. The man on the bench was no longer invisible. As the sun dipped low, long shadows stretched across the streets. An Echo Team assembled quietly in the heart of Ashwood. They didn't arrive with the thunder of battle, nor with weapons drawn. Instead, they came as a living testament to resilience, brotherhood, and honor. Connor stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. We stand not as warriors today, but as witnesses. Witnesses to sacrifice, to resilience, and to the quiet strength that binds us all. Frank's gaze swept over the gathering crowd. No roaring applause, no cheers, just solemn nods from strangers who, for the first time, truly saw him. In that still moment, the city's eyes opened. The gathering in Ashwood had done more than just reunite old warriors. It had ignited a spark, one that spread quietly but surely through the heart of the city. What started as a small stand in a forgotten park was now reaching into neighborhoods, homes, and the spaces between people. Frank found himself walking through streets he'd long avoided, past buildings that held memories both bitter and bittersweet. But now, something was different. Strangers who had once looked through him now offered nods of recognition, brief smiles, or even a polite greeting. They didn't know his full story, but they recognized the weight he carried, and they honored it in their own way. Local community centers, long underfunded and overlooked, suddenly became hubs of renewed purpose. Doors that had stayed closed to veterans began opening wider. Groups formed to offer support, counseling, job assistance, even just a place to share stories without judgment. Volunteers arrived in steady waves, bringing not just food and clothing, but genuine care and attention. Frank found himself attending a small meeting at the Ashwood Community Center. It wasn't a grand event. No speeches, no media, but the room hummed with quiet determination. Veterans sat alongside family members, neighbors, and advocates. They came not to ask for pity or charity, but to rebuild something broken: trust, connection, and respect. Mason stood, his voice calm but resolute. We've been ghosts in our own city for far too long, forgotten by the people we swore to protect, pushed aside when we needed help the most. It's time we make ourselves seen, not just as veterans, but as neighbors, as part of this community. Connor nodded, adding, respect isn't something handed out like a medal. It's earned through presence, through standing together, showing up, and demanding dignity for all who served, no matter where they are now. Frank listened, feeling a quiet hope stirring in his chest. The years of silence and exile weighed heavy, but the room reminded him he was no longer alone. The path ahead was uncertain and long, but for the first time in years, it was a path walked together. Outside the community center, Ashwood began to move forward, not as disconnected streets and forgotten faces, but as a community learning to remember, to honor, and to heal. And sometimes, the quietest steps make the strongest bridges. In the weeks following the gathering, Ashwood began to transform, not with sudden upheaval or grand declarations, but through steady, meaningful gestures that seeped into the fabric of everyday life. The city's forgotten corners slowly lit up with awareness and care, like dawn chasing away a long night. Local leaders, prompted by the voices of veterans and community advocates, started meeting behind closed doors, drafting plans for improved services, better housing, and mental health resources tailored for those who had served. What had once been whispers of neglect turned into actionable promises. Funding was discussed. Outreach programs were organized. The city was waking up to a responsibility it had long ignored. Volunteers showed up without fanfare, neighbors bringing meals, young people organizing clothing drives, and families offering rides to appointments. None sought credit. Their actions were quiet acts of repayment for the years of silence and invisibility. Frank found himself spending less time on the park bench that had been his refuge and more time at the community center, a place that was becoming a new kind of home. He walked the neighborhood as well, offering nods and soft smiles to those who recognized him now, not as a homeless man, but as a veteran, a brother, a part of something bigger. The scars he carried, etched deeply in his body and soul, remained visible reminders of a past that refused to be forgotten. But now, those scars weren't marks of isolation. They were badges of resilience, of survival. One afternoon, a local historian approached Frank in the park, holding a faded photograph of Echo Team, worn around the edges but still vibrant with memories. "We want to document your story," she said gently, "to include it in the city's museum, so no one forgets the sacrifices you and your team made." Frank hesitated. Pride warred with humility. The thought of reliving those memories was heavy. Yet, looking into the historian's hopeful eyes, he felt the weight shift, not for himself, but for those who had never returned, whose stories needed to be told. He nodded quietly. For them, a small ceremony was arranged in the park where Frank had spent so many silent days. City officials, community members, and veterans gathered. The air was filled with respectful silence as Frank's name was read aloud, accompanied by a solemn recounting of his service, the missions, the losses, the loyalty. There were no grand gestures or dramatic speeches, just sincere gratitude spoken in quiet tones. A simple plaque was unveiled nearby, a permanent testament to Frank and his brothers in arms. As the sun set behind the buildings, painting the sky with hues of amber and rose, Frank looked around at the faces before him, young and old, familiar and new. In that moment, the city saw him, not as a forgotten veteran, but as a man who had endured, who had fought, and who had been honored at last. The quiet strength of a warrior reclaimed. Recognition had come slowly for Frank Harlan, like dawn breaking through a long night. Yet, even as the city's eyes opened and the quiet honors began to flow, the shadows of his past remained etched deep, hidden beneath the surface but never far away. Those memories were not easily forgotten. They clung to him like a second skin, worn yet unyielding. Many nights, when the city's hum died down and the streets were swallowed by darkness, Frank would find himself alone on a bench, tracing the faded scars that ran beneath his sleeve. Each line told a story, some of pain, others of sacrifice. They whispered tales of firefights under foreign skies, of whispered orders passed in the dark, and of brothers lost in moments frozen in time. The faces of those who never returned came unbidden to his mind. Daniel, with his quiet laugh, Shade, whose steady hand had saved lives, Doc Ramirez, the healer who carried wounds of his own. These memories were both burden and blessing, reminders of a past life he could never truly leave behind. One cool evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft oranges and purples, Frank was approached by Leo, the young veteran who had sought him out weeks before. Leo carried his own losses, his own questions about what it meant to serve and what it meant to come home. "You ever think about going back?" Leo asked softly, sitting beside Frank on the park bench. Frank looked out over the park's quiet expanse. His voice was low, steady. "War's not a place you go back to, not really. The sounds, the faces, they don't leave you. But the fight I carry now isn't the same. It's about helping those who can't help themselves. It's about standing for something bigger than me." Leo nodded. "I'm searching, Franks. I want to do more. I want to help the ones left behind. The forgotten, like you were." Frank smiled faintly, a smile lined with years of pain and hope. "Then you're already on the right path. The fight doesn't end with the battlefield. It continues in every act of kindness, every moment you choose to stand up for someone who's been overlooked." They sat in comfortable silence, two generations bound by shared experience and mutual respect. In that moment, Frank saw more than his own story reflected in Leo's eager eyes. He saw a future where the forgotten would find their voices, where the next generation would carry the mantle with honor and resilience. Though the shadows of the past remained, unrelenting, the light of new purpose began to grow stronger, quiet, steady, and enduring. As summer edged toward fall, a quiet transformation took hold, not just in Frank, but in the entire Ashwood community that had begun to rally around him and the men of Echo Team. What had started as a reunion of old warriors now blossomed into a movement, one rooted in reclaiming dignity, healing old wounds, and rekindling a legacy that had long been buried beneath years of neglect and silence. Frank's days filled with purpose he hadn't felt in years. No longer just a solitary figure on a park bench, he became a mentor and guide to young veterans like Leo, men and women struggling to find their footing after the chaos of service. His counsel was steady and simple, yet carried the weight of experience. Resilience is forged in silence. Honor is reclaimed through consistent presence, and healing is a journey walked step by step. Together, they worked tirelessly alongside local organizations and community leaders to establish programs aimed at providing housing, mental health support, and job training for veterans in need. Frank's once quiet voice, nearly lost to years of isolation, now held a newfound strength and authority in meetings, town halls, and community events. His story became a beacon, a testament to what was possible when a community chose to see and support its forgotten heroes. One crisp afternoon, Frank walked through Ashwood Park and spotted a small group of children gathered around a freshly unveiled memorial plaque dedicated to the city's veterans. Their eyes were wide with curiosity and respect, and at the center of the group was Leo. With quiet pride, Leo patiently explained the significance of the plaque, the sacrifices made, the lives changed, the battles fought both abroad and at home. Watching them, Frank felt a warmth spread through his chest. This legacy, born from sacrifice and hardship, was no longer fading into the shadows. It was alive and thriving, in the hearts of the young, in the hands of those who chose to remember and honor. As twilight settled over Ashwood, painting the sky in soft purples and golds, Frank stood at the edge of the park, gazing out over the city that had once forgotten him. The scars he bore, both seen and unseen, remained, but alongside them stood strength, resilience, and a deep-rooted hope for the future. In the gentle hum of the evening, Frank smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. The fight was far from over, but this time he was not alone. The momentum in Ashwood continued to build, not with loud proclamations or grand parades, but with steady, unwavering commitment. What began as a reunion of old warriors had blossomed into a quiet revolution. Frank and his brothers in arms had become the city's silent vanguard, a steadfast presence dedicated not to battlefields but to memory, dignity, and healing. Their mission was no longer one of combat, but of compassion and community. Together, they organized workshops focused on mental health, breaking the stigma that had long kept veterans isolated in their struggles. They led neighborhood patrols aimed at protecting vulnerable veterans, not with force, but with watchful eyes and open hearts. Schools welcomed them to classrooms, where they shared stories, not of glory, but of sacrifice, resilience, and the real cost of service. Their presence became a steady undercurrent in Ashwood, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, but lived on in every quiet act of courage and kindness. One evening, after a long day spent in meetings and outreach, Frank found himself wandering the streets alone. The city was settling into night, the soft glow of streetlights casting warm pools of light onto cracked sidewalks. As he passed the old police precinct, a place that had once symbolized misunderstanding and tension, he noticed something new. Officers like Ruiz had started to see the weight of their duty beyond badges and regulations. The harshness that once marked their interactions was softening, replaced by a budding mutual respect born from understanding. Frank paused near the precinct's steps, his gaze drawn to a freshly painted mural on the brick wall. It was a striking portrait of veterans, young and old, faces etched with experience, eyes reflecting both hardship and hope. Beneath the image, a simple inscription read, "Honor the past, protect the future." A faint, genuine smile crept across Frank's face. This was the legacy they had fought so hard to rekindle, not through weapons or confrontation, but through presence, respect, and unyielding resolve. The fight was no longer fought on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of a city learning to remember and to heal. As the city's lights flickered on, illuminating the night, Frank felt a calm settle deep within him. The fight was far from over, but it was no longer a solitary battle. It was a shared journey, one toward healing, recognition, and a lasting honor that would ripple through generations. In that quiet moment, Frank knew they were no longer forgotten. Months had quietly slipped by since Echo Team's return, yet the city of Ashwood had begun to change in ways subtle but deeply meaningful. The place that once ignored its veterans was slowly weaving a new narrative, one threaded with recognition, respect, and healing. Frank Harlan walked the worn paths of Ashwood Park with a different gait now. No longer a shadow lurking on its outskirts, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had reclaimed his place, not just in the city, but within himself. The late afternoon air was crisp and carried the gentle scent of fallen leaves. Golden light filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with warm patterns as the sun lowered slowly toward the horizon. Around him, life thrummed softly. Children's laughter echoed as they darted between trees. Parents chatted quietly on benches, and elderly residents shared stories, their voices weaving a tapestry of community long forgotten. Where once there was silence and solitude, now there was connection, a rebirth of a place meant to be shared and remembered. Frank paused by a newly erected memorial, a simple granite stone inscribed with the names of local veterans. It was a humble monument, yet it carried profound weight. Placing a weathered hand on its cool surface, Frank felt a rush of memories cascade through him. Distant gunfire from missions far from home, the faces of comrades lost to time, and the aching silence that followed the battles. These memories, both bitter and sacred, were etched into his very being. But beneath the weight of those recollections was a new feeling, acknowledgement. The city was beginning to see, not just the soldier in the past, but the man standing in the present. Presence, honor. The community's embrace was fragile but growing stronger. A gentle hand rested on Frank's shoulder. Turning, he saw Leo, no longer the uncertain young veteran who had sought him out months ago, but a man stepping into his own, steady and sure. "We've traveled a long road," Leo said softly, his voice carrying quiet pride. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion, eyes moist with unshed tears. "Farther than I ever imagined." Together, they stood watching as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like bridges between history and tomorrow. No fanfare marked the moment. No speeches, no applause, just the solemn understanding that true homecoming often arrives in quiet, powerful moments. In the hush of the evening, Frank felt the burdens of decades, of loss, isolation, and silence, begin to lift, replaced by a calm peace that had long eluded him. He allowed himself a slow, genuine smile, the kind born from survival, from healing, and from hope rekindled. Beneath the fading twilight sky, amidst the rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the city settling down, Frank Harlan was finally home. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.